Hey there, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on the concept of moral character.
Okay.
It's one of those big ideas in philosophy, and we're going to be looking at it mainly through the lens of the ancient Greeks
Mm-hmm.
and kind of tracing how those ideas have evolved over the centuries.
Right.
So get ready for a deep dive tailored specifically for you, a fellow philosophy enthusiast.
Sounds like fun. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. To guide us on this journey, we'll be using mainly the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on moral character.
Okay.
It's really a great resource, and we're excited to really kind of unpack it together.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is moral character?
Right.
I mean, it seems pretty straightforward at first glance, but I think there's more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah, definitely. Even just the word character itself has like a really interesting history.
Okay.
It comes from the Greek word character, and originally it meant a mark impressed on a coin.
Hmm.
Like a stamp that would give it its value.
Oh, interesting. So initially it was a very concrete physical marking.
Yeah, exactly. But over time, that meaning kind of expanded. It came to represent any distinctive mark of an individual.
Okay.
And eventually, this led to like our modern understanding of character as like the set of qualities that make someone unique.
Right. So it became less about the physical marking and more about like the inner qualities that kind of make someone who they are.
Exactly.
And then philosophy comes along and adds another layer to it,
Yeah.
focusing on the moral aspect of these qualities.
Right. So moral character becomes less about just being distinctive and more about the collection of qualities that make someone ethically admirable.
I see. So it's about those traits that make someone a good person, someone we might even consider a role model.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a good starting point. But why did the ancient Greeks place so much emphasis on character in the first place? Like, why did they think it mattered so much?
Well, for them, it was all about living a good life, achieving what they called eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness or flourishing.
Okay, but this wasn't just about, like fleeting moments of pleasure.
Right.
It was something much deeper and more enduring.
Exactly. They believed that true happiness stemmed from living virtuously,
Okay.
from cultivating those qualities that allow you to consistently make good choices and live in accordance with reason.
So it's about aligning your actions with your values and living in a way that's both fulfilling and morally sound.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But even among the Greeks, there were some disagreements about how to define and understand virtue right.
Right.
They weren't like a monolithic block when it came to ethics.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, they generally agreed on the importance of virtue for a good life, but they had some different ideas about what constituted a virtuous person and how those virtues were acquired.
Okay, so let's dive into those different perspectives. Can we start with Socrates?
Sure.
I know he's often seen as the father of Western philosophy, so I'm curious about his take on virtue.
Well, Socrates, through Plato's dialogues, often challenged kind of simple behavioral accounts of virtues. He argued that it wasn't enough to just perform certain actions. It was about understanding why those actions were right
Right.
and having the wisdom to apply that understanding in different situations.
So it's not just about blindly following rules,
Mm-hmm.
but about developing the ability to reason well about moral matters and make sound judgments in complex situations.
Exactly. There's a great example in Plato's Republic
Okay.
where Socrates uses this example of returning a borrowed weapon.
Hmm.
And he says if the person you borrowed it from has like gone mad returning, it would be incredibly dangerous.
Right.
And so a truly just person wouldn't blindly follow that rule of like, oh, I have to return what I borrowed.
Yeah.
They would use their judgment to determine the right course of action.
That's a great example. It shows that being virtuous requires more than just rote memorization of rules.
Right.
You need to be able to think critically and adapt your behavior to the specific circumstances.
Right.
It sounds like good judgment, or what the Greeks called phronesis, is a key part of this.
Absolutely. Phronesis, or practical wisdom, is essential for discerning the right course of action in different situations. It's about being able to apply these general moral principles to specific cases, taking into account all the relevant factors and making wise decisions.
So in a way, it's like a moral compass that guides our actions.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a static compass.
Right.
It requires constant calibration and refinement as we encounter new situations and challenges.
That's a great analogy. It highlights that dynamic and nuanced nature of ethical decision-making.
Okay, so we've got this idea that virtue is about more than just behavior. It involves knowledge, good judgment, and this ability to apply moral principles wisely.
Mm-hmm.
This is making me think of Plato's famous division of the soul into three parts.
Right.
Did that influence his view of virtue at all?
It definitely did. Plato in the Republic argued that the soul has these three parts:
Yeah.
the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive. And these parts can often conflict with each other.
So it's like that classic image of the angel and devil on your shoulders, each whispering different advice.
Right. We all experience those internal battles between our desires and what we know we should do.
Exactly. And for Plato, true virtue involved not just knowledge, but also the proper training of those other parts of the soul.
Okay.
The emotions and the desires, they need to be educated and harmonized with reason.
So it's not about suppressing our emotions or denying our desire.
Right.
It's about bringing them into alignment with our rational understanding of the good.
Exactly.
It's like creating an inner harmony where all parts of ourselves are working together towards a common goal.
Precisely. Plato believed that when the soul is in this state of harmony, we are most able to make virtuous choices and live a truly fulfilling life.
This idea of inner harmony is really resonating with me. It seems crucial for both ethical decision-making and personal well-being. But I'm eager to hear how Aristotle, who's often considered the most systematic of the Greek philosophers, kind of further developed these ideas about virtue and moral character.
Okay.
He's famous for his Nicomachean Ethics,
Right.
right?
Yes, and it's in that work where he provides this very specific and influential definition of virtue.
Okay.
He describes it as a state concerned with choice, lying in a mean relative to us, this being determined by reason and in the way in which the man of practical wisdom, phronimos, would determine it.
Okay, that's quite a mouthful.
Yeah.
Let's break it down a bit. What does he mean by a state concerned with choice?
So for Aristotle, virtues aren't just like fleeting feelings or impulses.
Okay.
They are these stable dispositions ingrained in our character that influence how we make choices.
So they're more like ingrained habits of thought and action,
Mhm.
something that becomes a part of who we are.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that these choices aren't random. They're guided by reason.
Okay.
But then there's this idea of the mean, which is where things get really interesting and perhaps a bit more challenging.
Yes, the mean.
Yeah.
I remember grappling with this concept when I first encountered Aristotle. Can you explain it in a way that makes sense, maybe with some real-world examples?
Of course. So when Aristotle talks about the mean, he's not talking about like a mathematical average.
Right.
He's talking about finding that appropriate balance between two extremes.
So it's not about always taking the middle road,
Right.
but rather about finding the right response for each situation,
Mm.
which can sometimes be closer to one extreme or the other.
Exactly. Think of it like a tightrope walker. Staying balanced doesn't mean staying rigidly in the middle of the rope.
Right.
It means making these constant adjustments to maintain equilibrium.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this applies to virtue. Can you give an example of a specific virtue and how the mean works in practice?
Certainly. Let's take courage.
Okay.
So the extremes would be recklessness, which is excessive courage, and cowardice, which is a deficiency of courage.
So the courageous person isn't someone who's never afraid, but someone who can manage their fear and act bravely when it matters most.
Exactly. They assess the situation, weigh the risks and rewards, and then act in a way that's both bold and prudent.
It's like they're finding that sweet spot between recklessness and cowardice, that point where they can be both daring and wise.
Precisely. And finding that sweet spot is where phronesis practical wisdom comes in. It's the ability to discern the right amount of courage needed for each particular situation.
So it sounds like developing good moral character for Aristotle is all about cultivating these virtues, finding that mean, and honing our practical wisdom to make good choices.
Exactly. He believed that by living virtuously, we fulfill our function as human beings, which he saw as being rational and social creatures capable of making deliberate choices and living in community.
And this ties into his emphasis on the ideal political community, right? Didn't he believe that we need the right kind of social environment to truly flourish and develop virtuous character?
He did. Aristotle believed that individuals can only fully realize their potential within a community that provides opportunities for participation, education, and the pursuit of the good life.
So it's not just about individual effort. It's also about creating the right kind of social and political structures that support moral development.
Exactly. He envisioned a community where citizens actively engaged in political life, deliberated about the common good, and were educated to develop their virtues.
This is incredibly fascinating. It highlights how intertwined our individual character is with the social and political context we inhabit.
Absolutely. And it's an idea that has resonated throughout the history of philosophy, influencing thinkers from various traditions.
Okay, so we've explored Socrates' emphasis on knowledge and good judgment, Plato's idea of harmonizing the different parts of the soul and Aristotle's concept of virtue as a mean guided by practical wisdom.
Right.
But I know there were other important perspectives in ancient Greece, like the Stoics. How did their view of virtue differ?
Well, the Stoics, while agreeing that virtue is key to happiness, took a more cognitive approach.
Okay.
They emphasized the importance of controlling our emotions and focusing on what's within our control, which is primarily our own thoughts and actions.
I've always found this Stoic perspective both intriguing and a bit challenging.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of detaching yourself from external circumstances and focusing solely on your internal state seems incredibly difficult.
It definitely requires a different way of thinking about the world. But for them, it was the path to true freedom and tranquility.
So for them, happiness comes from accepting what is focusing on living virtuously and not letting yourself be swayed by external events or emotions.
Precisely. And they believed that by aligning our thoughts and actions with the rational order of the universe, we could achieve this state of inner peace that's unshakable.
That's a powerful idea. It seems like they're saying that true happiness is an inside job,
Right.
something we cultivate within ourselves rather than something we find in external circumstances.
Exactly. And this focus on internal virtue and self-control had a significant impact on later ethical thought, particularly within the Christian tradition.
That's a great segue into our next exploration.
Oh.
How did these Greek ideas about moral character evolve after the classical period?
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how those seeds of thought took root and transformed in different intellectual and cultural contexts.
Well, that's where we see a fascinating shift. With the rise of Christianity and then later secular moral philosophies, the emphasis moved away from virtue and towards concepts like duty, obligation, and moral law.
So it became less about developing good character and more about following rules.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite a significant change.
It is, but it wasn't a complete abandonment of those earlier ideas. Rather, it was a reinterpretation of them within new frameworks. As we'll see, the concept of virtue didn't disappear entirely. It simply took on a different role in these evolving ethical systems.
So it's like virtue became a byproduct of right action rather than the foundation for it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty significant shift in emphasis. But even during this period where duty and moral law were kind of dominant, were there any philosophers who tried to revive those ancient Greek ideas about virtue and character? Was there anyone who kind of pushed back against that trend?
Absolutely, yeah. Several philosophers really inspired by the Greeks sought to bring virtue back to the forefront of those ethical discussions.
Okay.
One of the most prominent figures in this movement was David Hume.
Right.
He explicitly stated his preference for those ancient ethical theories. He believed that morality is ultimately grounded in our passions, not just pure reason.
Oh, Hume. He was such a fascinating and influential figure. I love how he challenged those overly rationalistic approaches to morality. But how did he connect virtue to our passions? It seems a bit counterintuitive to think of emotions as the basis for moral behavior.
Well, Hume made this insightful distinction between what he called artificial and natural virtues.
Okay.
So artificial virtues, things like justice and promise-keeping, rely on social conventions and institutions.
Mhm.
They're essential for a functioning society, but they're not necessarily rooted in our immediate emotional responses.
So they're more about maintaining order and following rules even if they don't always feel intuitively right?
Exactly. Think about it. Sometimes justice might require us to act in ways that feel emotionally difficult, like upholding a law that we personally disagree with.
Right, because sometimes duty and our gut feelings might be at odds.
Precisely. But then there are the natural virtues. These are traits like courage, generosity, and compassion.
Okay.
And Hume believed that these virtues stem more directly from our sentiments and have a more immediate intuitive appeal.
I see.
They're about our natural inclinations towards certain kinds of behaviors and emotional responses.
So he's saying that we have this innate capacity for virtue, that it's not just something imposed on us from the outside.
Exactly. And he even suggested that some of these virtues like courage and ambition come from self-esteem, while others like generosity and compassion are rooted in benevolence and concern for others.
It's like he's echoing Aristotle's psychological approach, recognizing that our emotions play a vital role in shaping our moral character.
Yes. He saw this interplay between reason and passion as essential for understanding how we make moral judgments and develop virtuous character.
And didn't Hume also emphasize the importance of sympathy in moral decision-making?
He did. For Hume, sympathy was this crucial capacity to understand and share the feelings of others. It allowed us to move beyond our own narrow self-interest and consider the well-being of those around us.
So it's like he's saying that being virtuous requires us to develop our emotional intelligence, our ability to connect with and care for others.
Exactly. He saw this as a key component of what he called the judicious spectator, this like ideal observer who makes moral judgments from a detached and impartial perspective.
Okay.
And Hume argued that people who have cultivated the natural virtues, especially those rooted in benevolence and sympathy, are better equipped to take on the role of the judicious spectator.
Because they can see beyond their own biases and make fairer judgments.
Precisely. They can step outside of their own immediate experience and consider the perspectives and well-being of others.
This makes so much sense. It's like they've developed a broader moral vision that allows them to make wiser and more compassionate decisions.
Exactly. Hume brilliantly demonstrated how character and moral reasoning are interconnected.
This whole conversation about Hume's take on virtue has been so enlightening.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how he bridges that gap between those ancient Greek ideas and a more modern, nuanced understanding of morality.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious about how these concepts of virtue played out in more explicitly political philosophies.
Okay.
We talked about Aristotle in his Polis, but what about other thinkers who are grappling with the relationship between individual character and social structures?
That's a great question, and there were some fascinating perspectives on this, even from thinkers who aren't typically associated with virtue ethics. Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill, for instance, both had compelling ideas about how social structures can shape and influence moral character.
Marx and Mill, that's an interesting pairing. They're often seen as being on opposite ends of the political spectrum.
Right.
What were their key insights on this connection between society and character?
Well, both of them, in their own ways, drew inspiration from Aristotle's emphasis on community and the development of our rational powers. Marx, for example, was deeply critical of the alienating nature of labor under capitalism. He argued that the way work is structured under that system prevents workers from fully expressing their creativity, their reason, their ability to make meaningful choices.
So he's saying that capitalism, in a sense, stifles our human potential, our capacity for self-realization.
Exactly. He believed that this alienation from our work leads to all sorts of vices. Greed, envy, a focus on self-interest above all else. He envisioned a more egalitarian system where workers had control over their labor and could engage in more fulfilling, meaningful activities.
So for Marx, restructuring work wasn't just about economic fairness. It was about creating the conditions for moral growth and the development of virtuous character.
Precisely. He saw a direct link between social structures, the nature of work, and the cultivation of virtue.
And what about Mill? How did his ideas align with this focus on the social and political dimensions of character?
Well, Mill was a staunch advocate for individual liberty and social justice. He was especially concerned about the inequalities of his time, particularly the oppression of women. And like Marx, he recognized that these social structures have a huge impact on shaping our characters.
Didn't he argue that unequal societies, particularly those that subjugate women, actually hinder moral development for everyone involved?
He did. In The Subjection of Women, Mill critiques the traditional family structure, which he saw as a microcosm of unequal power dynamics. He argued that it breeds vices like selfishness, a lack of empathy, and a distorted sense of justice in both men and women.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
He's making a direct connection between gender equality and moral progress, arguing that true virtue can only flourish in a society that values and empowers all its members.
Exactly. And this aligns beautifully with Aristotle's vision of the polisens, this ideal community that provides the necessary conditions for individuals to develop their virtues and live fulfilling lives.
It's so interesting how these diverse thinkers, from Hume to Marx to Mill, each found their own way to connect those ancient Greek ideas about virtue to the social and political challenges of their times. It shows how relevant and adaptable these concepts are even centuries later. But did this trend of revisiting and reinterpreting those classical ideas continue? Were there other philosophers who carried the torch, so to speak?
Absolutely. In the late 19th century, T.H. Green, a British philosopher deeply influenced by Aristotle, developed his own version of virtue ethics.
Okay.
He argued that the ultimate good for humans lies in self-realization, the full development of our rational powers and our moral capacities.
So once again, we see that echo of Aristotle's emphasis on fulfilling our potential as rational beings. But what made Green's approach unique? How did he build upon those earlier ideas?
Well, Green was especially interested in how our moral development is intertwined with our social and political lives. He believed that true self-realization requires us to act for the good of others, not just ourselves. He saw this as the essence of a virtuous life.
It's like he's taking Aristotle's concept of the common good and giving it a more modern, socially conscious spin. He's saying that our individual flourishing is inseparable from the well-being of the community as a whole.
Precisely. And Green argued that the state, the government, has a vital role to play in creating the conditions that allow individuals to develop their moral capacities and live virtuous lives. He believed that a just and well-structured society could actually help to cultivate better citizens.
That's a powerful idea. It suggests that building a more virtuous world isn't just about individual effort. It's also about creating social and political systems that support and encourage moral growth.
Exactly. And this brings us to the 20th century and the influential work of John Rawls, who, as we mentioned earlier, really rekindled philosophical interest in questions of virtue and character.
Rawls. He's best known for his theory of justice, which is quite a complex and fascinating topic in itself.
Right.
But how did he connect that theory to the idea of moral character? Seems like a bit of a leap.
Well, Rawls, like the other thinkers we've discussed, recognized that the structure of society has a profound impact on the kinds of people we become. He argued that just institutions, those that are fair and equitable, actually shape our wants, our aspirations, and ultimately our characters.
It's like he's saying that if you want to create a society of virtuous individuals, you need to start by creating a just and equitable society.
Exactly. He believed that a just society, one structured according to his famous two principles of justice, would provide the framework for individuals to develop those virtues necessary for living a good life and participating as responsible citizens.
And just as a quick reminder for our listeners, those two principles are the principle of equal basic liberties, ensuring that everyone has the same fundamental freedoms, and the difference principle, which basically says that social and economic inequalities are only acceptable if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. But how did Rawls see these principles as promoting virtuous character? It seems a bit abstract.
Well, he argued that by guaranteeing basic liberties such as freedom of speech association and political participation, these principles would allow individuals to freely pursue their own conceptions of the good life and develop their moral capacities. And by ensuring a fair distribution of resources, the difference principle would create a more egalitarian society where individuals are less likely to be driven by envy, greed, and resentment.
So he's suggesting that a just society makes it easier to be good in a sense. It removes those structural barriers that can sometimes push people towards vice and creates a more nurturing environment for moral growth.
Exactly. He believed that just institutions, by promoting fairness and equality, actually contribute to the cultivation of virtuous citizens.
This whole discussion about the social and political dimensions of character is so insightful. It's making me think about the responsibility we have, not just as individuals, but as a society, to create the conditions that allow virtue to flourish. But as much as I appreciate this focus on external factors, it also raises some questions about individual agency and responsibility. If our characters are so heavily shaped by the societies we live in, then are we really responsible for our actions?
That's a great question, and one that contemporary philosophers are still debating. It touches on a long-standing philosophical puzzle: the relationship between determinism and free will. If our upbringing, our environment, and our social structures all contribute to shaping our character, then how much control do we really have over our choices and actions?
It's like that classic nature versus nurture debate applied to ethics. But it's a question with real implications for how we think about morality and hold people accountable for their behavior.
Exactly. And it gets even more complex when we consider some of the findings from social psychology, particularly the research on situationism.
Right. Situationism. That's the idea that our behavior is largely determined by situational factors, by the specific circumstances we find ourselves in, rather than by those stable, enduring character traits that philosophers have emphasized for centuries. It seems to challenge those traditional notions of virtue and character quite directly.
It definitely does, and it sparked a lot of debate within moral philosophy. The key question is, do these situational forces undermine our entire understanding of character, or is there a way to reconcile these seemingly conflicting views?
That's what I'm eager to explore, because we've seen how much emphasis philosophers from various traditions have placed on the idea of stable character traits as the foundation for a virtuous life. If situationism throws that whole concept into question, then it seems like we need to rethink our entire approach to morality.
Well, let's delve into the research on situationism and see if we can unravel this puzzle. It's a fascinating and challenging area of inquiry, and one that might force us to reconsider some of our long-held assumptions about human nature and moral responsibility.
Okay, so let's dive into this situationist challenge. What are some of the key studies that have led psychologists to question the power of character traits?
Well, some of the most influential research in this area comes from these social psychology experiments.
Okay.
And one classic example is the DIME study conducted by Eisen and Levin back in the 1970s.
Okay.
And they found that people who randomly found a dime in a phone booth were significantly more likely to help someone who dropped some papers nearby.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. So
Yeah.
even something as small as finding a dime could influence someone's behavior, making them more inclined to act helpfully.
Right.
It's almost like a little boost of good luck can make you a more virtuous person, at least for a moment.
Exactly. And it really challenges the idea that helpfulness is a stable character trait.
Right.
If it were, wouldn't those people have been equally likely to help regardless of whether they found a dime or not?
Right. It suggests that situational factors, those random occurrences in our environment, can have a real impact on our behavior,
Mhm.
perhaps even more so than our underlying dispositions.
That's the argument that situationists are making. And they have other studies to support their claims, perhaps most famously the Milgram experiment.
Ah, yes, the Milgram experiment.
Oh.
The one where participants were instructed to administer electric shocks to another person,
Right.
even when it seemed like they were causing pain. I remember learning about that in my Intro to Psychology class. Wasn't the conclusion that people are surprisingly willing to obey authority figures, even when it means going against their own moral intuitions?
That's right. The study found that a surprisingly high percentage of participants were willing to administer what they believed to be painful, even dangerous shocks, simply because a scientist in a lab coat told them to.
It's a bit unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah.
To think that our behavior could be so easily influenced by external pressure, even when it seems like we're crossing ethical boundaries.
It certainly raises some uncomfortable questions about human nature and the power of situational forces.
Right.
And it seems to challenge that traditional philosophical view that we have these stable character traits that guide our actions. If those traits were so robust, wouldn't people have resisted those commands even when faced with an authority figure?
That's the argument situationists are making. But how have philosophers, especially those who champion virtue ethics, responded to this challenge?
Right.
It seems like it throws a wrench into their whole system.
Well, they have a few key counter-arguments.
Okay.
First, they argue that situationists often misrepresent what character traits actually are. They kind of portray them as simple, inflexible dispositions to act in a certain way, regardless of the context.
So it's like saying that if someone is truly honest, they'll never lie, no matter the situation or the potential consequences.
Exactly. But that's a pretty simplistic and unrealistic view of character.
Right.
Virtue ethicists emphasize that having a virtue like honesty isn't just about blindly following a rule.
Okay.
It's about having the wisdom and discernment to understand when honesty is truly called for and how to express it in a way that's appropriate for the situation.
Right. It's about finding that balance between being truthful and being tactful, knowing when to speak up and when to hold back. It's not just about having a rigid disposition. It's about having the judgment and sensitivity to navigate those complex social situations.
Precisely. And this is where practical wisdom or phronesis comes in.
Right.
Virtue ethicists argue that virtuous individuals aren't just reacting to situations, they're actively deliberating about the best course of action, considering the potential consequences, and making judgments based on their understanding of what's good and right.
So rather than undermining the idea of character, those situationist experiments might actually be demonstrating the importance of phronesis. Maybe those participants who obeyed the authority figure in the Milgram experiment lacked the practical wisdom to fully grasp the ethical implications of their actions, or to find a way to resist those commands.
That's a very possible interpretation. And it
Yeah.
really highlights the fact that being virtuous isn't just about having good intentions. It's about having those intellectual and emotional skills to navigate those challenging moral dilemmas.
And this brings us back to that idea of character development as an ongoing process,
Yeah.
something that requires constant effort and self-reflection. It's not like we're born with a fixed set of virtues that determine our behavior for life.
Right.
We have to actively cultivate those virtues, hone our practical wisdom, and learn from our experiences.
Exactly. And this is where I think the insights of psychology can actually complement and enrich the philosophical study of virtue.
Okay.
Instead of seeing them as opposing forces, we can view them as different perspectives on the same complex phenomenon.
That's such a great point. It's not about choosing sides, but about finding ways to integrate these different approaches to gain a more holistic understanding of character and moral behavior.
Precisely. And there are some fascinating attempts to do just that.
Okay.
Some philosophers are drawing inspiration from psychological models like the Cognitive Affective Personality System, or VAPS model, to develop these more nuanced accounts of virtue.
Oh, I remember reading a bit about that model. It emphasizes the dynamic interplay between our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in different situations.
Right.
So it's not just about having a fixed set of traits, but about having a flexible and responsive system that adapts to the context.
Exactly. And this model allows for more complexity and nuance in our understanding of how character traits manifest themselves.
Right.
It also helps to explain why our behavior might not always be perfectly consistent across different situations.
Right, because we're not robots programmed to act a certain way. We're complex human beings who are constantly responding to and being shaped by our experiences.
Mhm.
But how does this CAPS model help us understand virtue? How does it fit into that philosophical framework?
Well, some philosophers are suggesting that we can think of virtues as these enduring dispositions that encompass not just our actions, but also our thoughts, emotions, and even our perceptions. So a virtuous person isn't just someone who habitually acts in a certain way, but someone who has cultivated a particular way of seeing the world, a way of understanding and responding to situations that aligns with their values.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. It's like they're saying that virtue is a kind of moral lens through which we experience and interpret the world.
Exactly. And this more holistic view of virtue allows for a more integrated approach to understanding character. It suggests that we can study the psychological underpinnings of virtue without reducing it to a set of simplistic behavioral tendencies.
This whole conversation has been so incredibly thought-provoking. We've journeyed through centuries of philosophical thought on moral character, grappled with the complexities of situationism, and explored some fascinating new ways of thinking about virtue that bridge the gap between philosophy and psychology.
It's been a real deep dive into a topic that's both timeless and incredibly relevant to our lives today.
I completely agree. And as we wrap up this episode, I'm left with this sense of hope and possibility. Even though those situationist studies might seem to challenge traditional views of character, I think they ultimately point us toward a richer and more nuanced understanding of what it means to be a virtuous person.
I couldn't agree more. It's not about achieving some kind of moral perfection, but about embracing that ongoing process of character development, cultivating those virtues, and honing our practical wisdom so we can navigate the complexities of life with greater integrity and compassion.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure exploring this topic with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We encourage you to continue pondering these questions about moral character and the role it plays in your own lives.